Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody joining us today for another Founder and Friends. My name is John Daniel Trask. Everybody just calls me JD. And I am today joined by Andre Kramer. Welcome, Andre.
Yeah, good morning. How are you doing?
I'm very good, and I really do appreciate you joining us today. I'll give a quick bit of a background here for our
Yeah,
listeners today. So you've been a Microsoft MVP for many, many years, so you're fairly
yeah,
heavily into the .NET space, but we connected
yeah.
over mobile as well, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. So we connected when I wrote a blog post on how to use Raygun in a .NET MAUI app because of a lot of developers have now are in the situation that they have to switch from App Center to Raygun because Microsoft decided to retire App Center next year. And so this was when I decided to research some alternatives and wrote the blog post about Raygun. That's how we met. Yeah.
Yeah. And I really appreciate you putting those together. It has been an interesting pathway in mobile land for Microsoft developers recently.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we'll come back to that. But one of the things that was really interesting was that when we had a pre-call for kicking this off, is that Andre and I realized we're both developers who have built a business as well, right? And so you've been on how long have you been on that path for?
So I've been on the business side for the last, I think, 12 years right now. So I started out as a freelancer 12 years ago.
Hmm.
And then 6 years ago, I founded my own LLC in order to grow business a little bit.
Yep. Now I detect a subtle accent there. So you're not in America. Where are you based?
So I'm from Germany, which you probably already heard by my accent because it's not really perfect. And sometimes I tend to, well, make up some words which sound English, but they are not. So whenever I say something that makes no sense to you, just ask and, and try to rephrase it.
LLMs are worth a lot of money, so your hallucinations might be a feature, not a bug. So that's all good. Well, I just thought let's begin a little bit. Maybe we start by tackling the Microsoft story a bit, and then we're going to phase into talking a little bit about how we both shifted into starting businesses. We really wanted,
Absolutely.
yeah, we wanted to make sure that this was a session for those listening that maybe you're already running a business, maybe you have a side project, or maybe you're thinking about, hey, what would it take to sort of step out and build something yourself? But let's start on how we connected up initially on the mobile side. So as you mentioned, we've got App Center is being retired, Xamarin's being retired, we've
Yeah.
got Maui turning up, we've got Blazor as well for some
Yeah.
options in here. I'd love to just kind of get your take from what are you seeing across your clients in the market, and what is the shift? One area I'm particularly curious about is I'm not sure that everybody's moving from just Xamarin to Maui. It's an opportunity to evaluate the
Yeah.
full field. What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, it's an interesting situation right now. As you said, Microsoft has retired Xamarin, so the support ended just a month ago on May 1st. And a lot of companies that build apps with Xamarin still have not moved to .NET MAUI for various reasons. So some of them were not even aware that Xamarin is not longer a thing because they are not reading all the Microsoft blogs and attending the build or .NET Conf.
Mm,
So what Microsoft then did was when you opened a Xamarin project, you had a little yellow bar in Visual Studio saying, well, this will be retired, so you should switch to MAUI soon. And this, of course, led to some traction that companies said, well, we have to do something there. And they even did it themselves, or they search for help, such as we do. So for example, one thing that we did is we wrote a little tool where you can put your source code into, and we will analyze it to see how much effort it will take to actually migrate your app from Xamarin to .NET MAUI, because there are some places or some apps that can be easily migrated, especially if you have a lot of third-party plugins used. But depending on the libraries you have used, it might be a very, very hard way to get from Xamarin Forms to .NET MAUI.
Yeah, I recall as we were building out our support and how we initially, I think the joke within the team was it feels like they've done a find and replace on the word Xamarin to Maui. And I think that was a really interesting statement because let's compare it to another transition from .NET Framework to .NET Core. I found that a reasonably challenging transition because
Right.
.NET Core initially obviously had a much smaller API surface, so you
Indeed.
were often trying to find things that change, and that was before you got to functional changes. You know, the
Yeah.
HTTP client is a good example. However, in the Maui world, it feels to me like if you were to make the migration now, it's probably going to be easier than in the future as Maui starts to diverge more from where Xamarin came from. Would that be a fair sort of assumption to make, or is that no? Just wait until it gets even better. What would your sort of advice to be to somebody who maybe has a Xamarin app today?
Yeah. So I would totally say migrate it today. And that's not the reason is not that I'm saying that it will be harder in the future. The reason for that is you're actually having no support for Xamarin anymore. So which means that whenever something crashes, so let's say that a new version of Xcode is required to upload your app to the iOS App Store, then you're totally out of luck because Microsoft will not give you any support in that way. So you should get your application moved to Maui as soon as possible. However, I don't think that from a code side it will be harder. It will probably be a bit easier because one thing that currently is a problem that there are some, well, open source projects or third-party libraries which have not been migrated from Xamarin Forms to Maui yet, which means if you have a dependency on those in your source code, then you have probably to migrate this yourself or to look for another alternative. And so if you wait, you have a chance that those will be migrated by somebody else. You have less
Yep.
work, but you, of course, take the risk of not being able to ship upgrades to the App Store currently.
Yep. Now I know that Maui sort of plays a role as well within the Blazor hybrid sort of space
Yeah.
for multi-platform. I've been talking to a few people about this, including on some Founder and Friends episodes. If you actually had to make the decision yourself, are we going to go Blazor hybrid, pure Maui, other? What would be your advice? Let's start with just those first two, because I think that's probably the question on a lot of Microsoft developers' mindsets before maybe learning a whole new stack.
Absolutely. Well, so as a good consultant, I would say it depends. And the reason why I'm saying that is it depends on several things. So it depends on your skill set. So let's say you have a team of web developers and they already know Blazor, then I would totally go there and use Blazor. On the other side, if you have, for example, a team who really knows a lot about XAML because they did Xamarin Forms or WPF in the past, then Maui with XAML UI is the way to go. However, there's one other thing that you have to take into account. So the idea of Maui is that you have what is called virtual views, which is like an abstraction of the underlying UI control, which means when you have, for example, a button or a text box or a label, and you use this in your Maui app, then the Maui engine will not render it like, for example, Flutter does rendering on itself, but instead it will use the native control, which is used on the platform SDK. So for example, you will have a UI text view on iOS and the native text box on Android and a text box on Windows and so on. Which means if you want an app that looks exactly the same on all three platforms, then this will be very challenging with .NET MAUI because all the native controls look a little bit different. So they look are native to the platform, but they don't look the same across platforms. On the other hand, when you use Blazor, which is in the end HTML and CSS, you can just style it once and it will look the same on all the platform, no matter if you're on iOS, Android, Windows, or macOS.
That's a really, really interesting distinction, and kind of showing my age a bit here. But I remember when Java's whole story was, write once, run everywhere. And I remember as a young man being like, yeah, but I don't want to have pink and purple scroll bars, like, because it would do all of its own rendering of those controls or whatnot, way back in the day. But yeah, and so beyond that, obviously there is the skill set side. If somebody was to break outside of the Microsoft ecosystem, would you be, and I know it's going to be another, it depends, but would you be pushing the idea of like a Flutter or going to more of a direct to native platform? Like,
Yeah. Once again, it depends. So if you only have to target one platform, so for example, we have customers and they have those specialized Android devices from, for example, Zebra or other manufacturers with a barcode scanner on there. So if
Yep.
you only have to target those, then native is totally a great option because you have to write the code only once. However, if you want to target both iOS and Android and you go full native, then there are two things that can happen. The one thing is you have one team and they start with one platform and then try to learn the other, which is a whole other skill set, which means that you will have a delay in the publishing of the initial version and of updates oftentimes. And the other way you can go is just to have two teams. And I'm pretty sure that you have realized that if you give the same set of requirements to two teams, you will have two totally different interpretations on how to actually implement those, which means that you have the risk of having two different sets of functionality on both platforms, which could make users unhappy that use both platforms. So, which means to me, whenever you have to target more than one platform and you want to, you don't want to spend too much money, then you're better off with a cross-platform framework. Like, I mean, there's Flutter, there's React Native, there is JetBrains Compose, multi-platform. There are a ton of options. And of course, when you're a .NET developer, the greatest one is .NET MAUI because you have the complete .NET ecosystem. So you can use all your favorite libraries, your favorite IDE, all the tools you're used to use in your day-to-day development.
And so let's shift this slightly from before we get to starting the business, but we've been talking about these mobile stacks. Now, the name of your business is Quality Bytes.
Yeah.
You're focused, and this is one of the things I loved about our conversations, is you've got a really high attention to wanting to deliver high quality software.
Absolutely.
And that's why I'm so happy that you discovered Raygun. That's something that matters a lot to me. It's funny, you're being on the receiving end of so many software errors is both it's interesting. It tells a story about the quality of the broader software ecosystem and the challenges that we are all having in sort of fighting against the complexity and general challenges. Sometimes you can write something that works fine, but then as we've sort of covered here, if the underlying platform changes, you can go from fine to not fine. So I thought let's do a little bit of a deep dive here for a second on your approach to quality, your thinking about quality. We won't necessarily dive so much into tools, but like what are some of the things that you think every team should be doing? But also like what are some of the things coming up or things folks should be thinking about around software quality?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that you have to have is the correct mindset. And so, for example, I worked with people in the past and their goal was to ship software as quickly as possible. And that's fine for some projects, but in the end, oftentimes this leads when you rush over your development process, this leads to poor quality, which in the end will take longer time because you have to fix all those bugs. You have to spend a lot of time and money to get it right, and your customer will be probably quite angry at the end because they didn't really want to pay for all this trouble they're having.
Yep.
So that's the first thing. You need to have the correct mindset. And then, of course, there are some good practices and tools which can help you. So like, for example, having automated tests, like unit tests, integration tests, UI tests, doing test-driven development helps so that you write small pieces of source code and don't overcomplicate things at first, which we tend often to do as developers. And then, of course, there are tools that can help you. Like, for example, we used to extensively use static code analysis with tools like SonarQube in our build process, so that we can make sure that whenever we put something new into our main branch, that quality goes up and not down. And this is not somebody feels that it doesn't go down, but that there's a tool which tells you, well, so you just introduced like whatever 3 days of technical depth, and you should probably work on that.
Yep. Yeah, I don't even know if a 1 hour podcast is enough to talk about technical debt, but the one of the things I regret that we used to do this in our organization was every single project we would always make sure we turned on things like warnings as errors, you know, and therefore you break the build server even on a warning. And if you do that right at the start, you know, that makes sure that those warnings never get out of control. And then, you know, sharing a little bit here, the one project where we didn't start off that way was Raygun itself. And so all of our prior ones, we'd done this for, and we still to this day battling some of these things around that where I kind of go, gosh, and all it took was ticking that box on the first day we were getting started to establish that practice in there. Absolutely, I like to rely on the infrastructure of CI/CD in there. I still recall back in my very first job building out, I think it was cruisecontrol.net at the time, and you didn't really have CI and CD servers then, so I would usually just run it on my PC I think it was even monitoring SourceSafe to show my age. And it's interesting because I felt like I landed in the industry just at the right time, that like the automation and the quality was sort of taking off, and then I feel like it's been a good 20 years since those things sort of came around. They're now obviously widely adopted. That's where I haven't really seen what's the next step. You know, how do we take this up a level? I am kind of curious if maybe this is where AI with LLMs around automatically repairing things could be a step. And even to your point earlier, where you raised the converting Xamarin to sort of Maui code tool. For all of Microsoft's talk about copilots, I'm like, just give me the one that convert from .NET Core to full, from framework to core, you know, in a smarter way than just straight templating A to B. You know, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but I haven't seen too much that's turned up in that space yet. Have you?
No, I haven't, but I want to get back to some points you mentioned earlier, because I think they are so interesting. So one thing you mentioned is CI/CD. This is totally a thing that everybody should do, and unfortunately, I still see a lot of people who don't. So before I started Quality Bytes, I worked mainly as a trainer. So I gave classes on software quality and so on. And there were so many companies where you come to and you ask, what is your build process looking like? And they pointed over to a guy sitting somewhere in the corner of the room, said, well, it's him. So he uses Visual Studio and presses F5 to build some exe files and DLLs, and then zips them and uploads them to whatever. So I think it's such a critical step to have CI and CD to improve your quality. And another thing that you mentioned, which made me thought, so you talked about the checkbox from errors at treating warning as errors. And one thing that I thought about is what we do in addition to all the tooling stuff that we talked about is we make sure that when a developer develops something, it is done in a separate feature branch, and it only goes after a peer review into the main branch. So it's always 2 people, at least, sometimes even 3 or 4, who know the source code. Yep. And we do this for several reasons. The first one is to spot bugs, obviously, or even code smells that we don't want to have in the code base. And the other thing is, when you do that, you always have more than one person who knows the source code, which means that person who originally wrote it can go on holiday without having without having to be afraid that the phone will ring the whole day and say, well, can you fix that? And have you a laptop with you? Can you fix that? So a lot of interesting stuff that you just mentioned. And I think that's where IA will actually help. I'm not sure, have you had the chance to look at the pull request features of GitHub Copilot?
I've only seen the demonstrated capabilities of that. I haven't used it myself yet. I've played with Copilot, but not the pull request side of it, I should say.
Yeah, so we did play around a bit with the pull request side, which looks great. But unfortunately, our company uses Azure DevOps and not GitHub for storing our source codes, which means that we can't use it in production because, at least until now, Microsoft had made clear that they will not migrate this feature from GitHub to Azure DevOps as well.
Let's sidebar that for 1 second. Is that we've got a lot of customers who use Azure DevOps, and to be honest, a lot of them cite a range of features and capabilities that they absolutely love about it. So this is not not one is clearly better than the other. And then on the GitHub side, clearly Microsoft owns two two products that have a high level of overlap. Maybe this is just a pure speculation question, really, but where do you see the future of that going? Because I would be nervous, just being frank.
Yeah. So personally, I was very, very worried when they acquired GitHub, because I've been using Azure DevOps and Team Foundation Server before that, since it originally was released. And we really built our whole development process around it. And so I was afraid that they would just retire Azure DevOps and have everybody move to GitHub. And for some time, it looks like that because there was not a lot of innovation in the Azure DevOps space. So it was like when you looked at the releases and Azure DevOps, they have a 3-week release cadence, which means you get a new version online in the cloud every 3 weeks. There were, for a couple of months, not really great new features. However, that's only my personal impression. That's not something that I know from the product team or something like that. Mm-hmm. But I think that a lot of big companies probably started to complain loud enough that GitHub was not the platform of choice for them for whatever reason. I mean, for example, GitHub is very, very developer-centric. The first thing you see when you open it is the repository and source code view, which is great for developers, not so great for product owners, product managers, and other stakeholders. There are some things about work item handling, which personally I like more about Azure DevOps. And so my take is that those big companies, they complained loud enough so that Microsoft put some more investment. But that's just my personal point of view.
Yeah, and like I say, it's not a put down. It's more of a kind of switching to what you and I have both done in sort of transitioning from tech into running a business. Is I know if I was sitting here selling 2 crash reporting products, I would it would be on my mind. Why am I doing 2 of these things? Especially if I spent $7.5 billion to buy one of them. But we have lots of happy customers using it, and I do talk to a lot of folks who absolutely love it, which is cool. So let's shift these gears then a little bit. Maybe when we will start transitioning a wee bit away from the tech side and into the business side. So I always love the founding sort of story. Okay, so like, how did this get going? At what point did you say, screw it, I'm going to start my own thing? How did that go?
Yeah, that was an interesting transition. So I started first as probably, most other people as a software developer at some company and developing some, individual software. And then I moved to a product company, and from there to a big consulting company. And one thing I realized is that personally, I needed far less input from my supervisor than my coworkers did. So I was always self-motivated and had all the project goals in mind and tried to really finish it and give the last, do all the required steps to make the customer happy without having somebody tell me, well, Andre, today you have to do this and that and that. So this is one thing, being very self-motivated. The other thing was that, so most companies have those yearly, how do you call it? Those meetings you have with your supervisor where you talk about your personal development. I'm sure it's called in English. Anyway, so during those conversations, I realized that the ideas that my team leaders or supervisors were having for me were totally in conflict with what I wanted to do. So, for example, I really loved to create content for developers, which meant that At some point in my career, I wrote about how you use jQuery and SharePoint, where both were totally great technologies at that point in time. And so my former boss came to me and he said, well, yeah, nice that you did that, but I want you to write something which targets another audience, for example, like managers in large organizations. And I said, well, no, that's not what I really want to do. I probably will not be happy having somebody else telling me what to do. And so this was when I first started thinking about creating my own company or just going freelance at first. And then at one point, one of my customers where I used to work for, he told me that, hey, whenever you decide to quit your current job and go freelance, I will continue to book you. So I said, well, that's interesting. So because I haven't made the decision until that point, I haven't not told anybody about that. But he just made me an offer, and I said, well, that's interesting. So it looks like it's not too hard to get customers when you're self-employed. And so this started me thinking more and more. And I think at one point in time, there was a project really going bad because of bad management. I said, well, I don't want to do this anymore, working all those nights, putting all those overtime into to my work, just because somebody above me decided to or took the wrong business decision. So this was the point where I wanted to make my own.
That's a great story, and it's always so confidence building when somebody else says, you know, if you did this, I would employ you. And it's actually not, this part's not my story, it's my good wife's story, which was she was in a similar situation where she was working for one organization and as a contractor, and she got a second contract with another organization, and she's a very straight up person. So she said, hey, you know, I meant to tell you about this, you know, under our agreement. And they said, yeah, we don't want you to have the other contract. And she was put in a bit of a bind because she didn't want to let down the other party either. And so she went to them and they said, well, we'll pay you for a year on this contract. And so so then she said, okay, well, I'll start my own business and I'll go with this customer. And then, of course, 6 weeks later, the one that she left came back and said, hey, we actually still need your skills. And she said, okay, well, now I'm a company and my rate's like 3x. And they were like, oh, that's fine, just come on in. And so she ended up with still both of them as customers, paying a lot more, larger commitments, you know, and all of that. And so it all worked out. But the really big piece was seeing that first person that would take a punt, you know. And there's a famous video. It's a lot of people may have seen it floating around. It's a guy dancing on a hill. And he looks like, to be honest, he seems like he's on drugs. He's like dancing out, going crazy, you know. And then eventually somebody else joins him. And then within like 5 minutes, there's 50 people dancing on the hill. And it says it's actually not about the first person. It's about the second. It's that one that follows that really suddenly the ball starts to roll. And so sounds like that was the confidence boost that you needed to sort of step out and go, okay, let's do this. So how did you start to build it up from there, though?
So the interesting thing was when I finally made the decision to quit my job, the day after that, I met this manager at the other company, and I told him, hey, I quit my job. I will start my own company. And he was totally shocked because he said, oh, I hope you did not do that because of what I told you before, because just the other day we got a new CEO. And he decided that we will cancel all the contractors that we have. So we can't give you any work. So I hope that was not the reason. And this was not the best feeling in the world to just have quit your job. And at that point in time, I have to say that everybody around me, except my wife, said that this was a really stupid idea to quit my job, because I really had a great job. I was a senior architect at a large US based company, and I was married. We had 3 children. We have just put all our savings into building our house. We had a huge, how do you say it, debt loan on there.
Yep.
And my wife stayed at home because we had 3 small children, and she had to take care about that. And I was the one who had to take financial care for the whole family, and we had the risk of losing the house if I can't pay back the credit. So everybody around me said, "Don't do it." What I was really happy about is that my wife said, "Well, I'm pretty sure you can do it, and you should just follow your dream there and do it." However, I was confident that it would work out because I had this one person who told me, I will book you." And when he told me that he won't, I got a bit nervous. So what I did is, so I had already quit, and it was like I had a period of 3 months until I finished at my job. So I just started applying for other jobs and going to the interviews there. And so I went to 2, and I got offers from both companies, which I did not take. But I was very, very confident because I said, well, if I go to 2 interviews and I get 2 offers, then if this all goes wrong, then I can be pretty sure that I will get easily a new job, hopefully. And so, however, it turned out that the former boss of a friend of me, he founded a company some months before that, and he needed a software architect, and he didn't find one. And so when he heard that I was going to freelance, he said, "Well, you know what? I don't have the budget for a freelancer. I have the budget for an employee. So if we can agree on a lower rate than what you would charge to other clients, then I give you a contract of 6 months with 50% work time there. And so you have the other 50% to search for other clients." And of course, this did not help to build a huge pile of money, but it did pay the bills and gave me the chance to, start with in a lot less riskier situation into my self-employment then.
That I love the fact that you had, and I say this with love, that you had such a dreadful situation sort of happen the second you stepped out, because that is something I don't think a lot of people who don't actually start a business ever fully. I have this saying, and some people don't like it, which is basically, I think a lot of empathy conversations are bullshit, because you actually need to experience something to properly understand it. And it's like, oh, all these business people, they just make all this money and they're all rich and they're the bad people. And you're like, boy, tell me you've never done this to think that's reality. And you've stepped out, you've taken this risk, and that's it. It's the risk. Your whole family is on the line. Your house is on the line. You've got to find this. You get this. You get this piece. So now you've got part of the week filled. Now, I could be wrong here, but I'm thinking that you're probably still pretty strained at this point for looking after the family, taking care of the debts, looking for other work, all of this sort of stuff. So you've shifted from, eventually you're going to go freelancer up to a company. Let's look at that next stage. How did you kind of build the snowball up a little bit?
Yeah, so when I started freelancing, as I said, I started out as a developer or a software architect, and transitioned after a year or so to teaching classes for software development, software architects, doing consulting in that area. And while I did that, a lot of companies where I taught classes, they started asking if I can do small projects for them. So develop a small tool or write a small web application, something like that. And I happily accepted those offers because to me it was always important that I know what I'm teaching so that I actually do it and not just tell what's written in the books, but that I have real world experience in. So when there were more and more projects, I hired my stepson, who just turned 17 at that time. He finished school and was looking for a job, and I said, "Well, you know what, you really spend a lot of time in front of your computer playing Minecraft, so I'm pretty sure that you can spend a lot of time writing software. It's similar." He said, "Well, give it a try." And so then it was the 2 of us writing software. And then at one point, a company approached me and they wanted to have a software which was just too huge for us to develop it. And so at first I wanted to turn down the offer because I thought, well, I can never do this with my stepson, just the 2 of us. And I discussed this with my wife, and she said, "Well, why don't you just expand and found an LLC?" And I said, "Well, I'm not sure about that. It's a huge risk." And she said, "Well, it turned out well the other time, so maybe try it another time." And looks like she was right, because what I then did is I rented an office and registered the LLC and tried to find employees, which was pretty hard at first because so I think at that point I already did a lot in the developer community, which means I gave talks at conferences, I wrote articles, blog posts, so I was well known in the German speaking community. And I thought, well, when I ask somebody if he wants to ask with me, they will all come over and say, "Well, great idea." But it turned out that all of the people I knew were hesitating because they said, "Well, sounds good, but you've been in business for like a day, and I have a family, I have a house, I have a lot of responsibility. I'm not sure if this will work out what you do, and I don't want to take the risk," which, well, I can understand because I had the same thoughts when I started to freelance before that. So, which means that it took me a year before I was able to hire the first time full-time employees. So I had two apprenticeship before that,
Hmm.
and one freelancer, but took me a year until somebody said, "Well, yeah, I believe that this can work what you
Yep.
want to build there. So let's do it." And I'm quite happy that all the people that I hired back then, they're still working at the company. So turned out to be a good idea for them and for me.
Your your wife sounds like a fantastic supporter, and
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember reading that one time years ago. I'm not 100% sure it's true, but I've read it, which was a conversation I think with Steve Jobs, where he was saying that he said if you look at Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, he's like, what was one of the major wins? And he's like, we both married well. uh, I think it's absolutely true. It is a partnership.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And I'm not sure about you, but one of the things that brings me probably the most day-to-day joy in building a
Yeah.
business is that it is around the people. And look, there is a
Yeah.
risk in running a business, but kind of sitting there knowing it is actually paying people's the word in English, by the way, is a mortgage, but the debt on a
Yeah.
house. Yep. And so
Thank you.
they've got all these things, their kids, I love seeing the kids because you kind of think actually their whole lifestyles and everything is really being funded out of the fact that we're building this great stuff to help other people.
Yeah.
And I think that's a funny thing in business, right? Is
Yeah.
there's so much discussion around it, but at the baseline level, you know, all capitalism really is providing value to other people.
Absolutely.
And if you can't provide value to them, they don't give you money. And so it's just a system for figuring out what is the biggest contribution you can make to society. And society, it turns out, can be pretty uncaring for your hobby interests if it's not what society wants.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so you get your first employee. That starts building up. Actually, as a sidebar, as I understand it, Germany is quite a challenging country. I think to actually operate a business in. I say that obviously I have an accent too from New Zealand. New Zealand has a lot of great support around employee safety, security, all of that sort of
Yeah.
stuff. Was that a layering of the complexity that made it difficult for you around getting started in Germany? Do you think that would have been different elsewhere, or is it just no? It was just the risk profile of being a new company.
I think it was just a risk profile. So, of course, I don't have any experience founding companies in other countries, so I'm not
Yet,
sure if
ask your
it's
wife; she
easier.
might say time to expand.
Maybe, yeah. So what we recently did is we started to expand into the US, but we don't have any offices there. We just work remotely for them. But anyways, so I don't really think that. So of course, in Germany you have a lot of how do you call it, bureaucracy, something like
Hmm.
that. Yeah. So which means like when you want to found a company, when you want to register it, it takes like when you're happy, like for example, 6 weeks, and if you have bad luck, could be 6 months
Wow.
until somebody gives you the allowance to eventually operate the business. But that's only if you want to found an LLC. So starting on your own was totally easy. So you just have to register a tax ID for your company and you're ready to go.
Yep.
So so I don't think that, being based in Germany was really the reason why it was hard to get the first employees, because what we here have too is great social security for the employees as well. So when you lose your job, you will get some money from the state, which is totally fine. It's just that a lot of people don't like to lose jobs, and maybe what I see around German people is, I think that is one thing that is pretty German, is a lot of German people don't like to take risks. So they tend to, they want to have everything safe. And so taking risk is not so popular around here in Germany.
Yeah, it certainly is it's a calculated risk.
Yeah.
I remember when we started our first business, so we were originally called Mindscape, and I was 23 at the time. So I like to think that my 20s were really my own apprenticeship in business. You know, I don't pretend to have known much back then. And I'll contrast and compare here just because I find it interesting. So in New Zealand, you could form a company for about $120 in about 45 minutes on an internet form. So it does not take long to set up here. But yeah, we started the business, and we got this. I'll always call this out because it was effectively our founding cash. So we saved up as much money as we could. Like I say, I was 23. I'd only actually worked for 3 years for somebody else, and while I had built some little businesses at university, I had probably rightly decided to spend all my money in the when I finished university, and you have that final holiday, which was like 6 weeks long, and in my head I was like, this is my last holiday until I'm retired, like, you know, go and enjoy this. And so I saved all my money for those 3 years, and then we started Mindscape. And Microsoft New Zealand turned up in particular, and I might miss some names, but there was a few key people there, Nigel, Daryl, and others that had that's Nigel Parker and Daryl Burling, neither of which are at Microsoft anymore, but they came to us and gave us this contract to build a system to demonstrate how to build a modern scalable web application on the Microsoft stack. And we literally got that contract on the first day we had started the company.
Awesome.
And that was because my business partner at the time, Jeremy, he had actually helped Microsoft get the user groups running in Wellington. He had a great relationship with them. And to your point, he was a regional director, which I was an MVP like you. Regional directors are the ones like the next level up even. And so we got this great contract, and really that was our seed capital. And so we got that money in, which for us was about 250,000 Kiwi dollars, which was probably about 200,000 US for listeners at the time. And I remember we finished this project, and at the time, a computer game had come out called Supreme Commander, and we loved playing that game. And so every day at about 4 o'clock, the three of us would bash out a multiplayer game of this. And I remember we were sitting there, and it was like, you know, no one cares what we do. You know, like no one, like we're coming to work, and it was that moment that we realized we could just sit here playing Supreme Commander all day until our money ran out and we'd have to go find jobs. And that was the piece where you kind of do realize that it all comes down to the self-drive. You know, it's like everybody would rather come in and play computer games, but like that's not going to go very far. You have to get to the point where somebody actually cares that your business exists and it's providing that value to them. And so that until we put a product in the market where there was something where we could kind of keep seeing, is this resonating? I don't know. I didn't find it that interesting. I found the very, very start quite challenging, just to be like, gotta kind of get over that initial hump of shipping your first product. That is a product business side, because we initially were very much bootstrapped. So it was sort of balancing services work that would then fund our product development work at the time.
I think that's a great idea, because as soon as you take outside money at an early stage when you're building a company, then you don't really own your company anymore, and you're probably more busy talking to your investor instead of moving forward your business. So I think just earning your own money and then spending this and investing it in your company is the way to go. But I'm curious. So, what was your original business idea when you founded Mindscape? You just said that you've got on the first day the contract with Microsoft, but you probably did not know that before. So, what was your original idea when you started your company?
Yeah. So when we well, so I'm definitely a nerd's nerd, so right. So I've liked programming languages and
Yeah.
geeky stuff since I was very young, and when I worked my first job at this company called Intergen, even though they were using C# and .NET, so this was sort of Visual Studio, about .NET 1.1, I think, was
Yeah.
when I turned up. And so they had built this internal object relational mapper and that they called Traction. And at the time, Link to SQL didn't exist and
No.
EF didn't exist. There basically wasn't an ORM in the Microsoft space. And so having seen this and seen the productivity benefits of
Yeah.
not using an ORM, we decided that we would do our first product was going to be an ORM for .NET. Now, let me start by saying I actually do not suggest trying to commercialize an ORM as a great way to make a heck of a lot of money. But we focused on it as a way of like, hey, we have to put the wheels on our product delivery process. Like as we kind of looping right back to the start, how are we going to run CI/CD? How are we going to release the stuff? How are we going to get it out to customers? And so we built that ORM, and it actually turned out to do economically quite well for us over the years, which I was surprised by. That ORM was called Lightspeed, and it was actually, if I do say so myself, I think it did a good job of balancing a really relatively clean API with a good performing underlying engine. And so we started selling that, and interestingly, and at the time, the component vendors in the Microsoft space were the likes of Telerik and the likes. And so one of the things we did with CI/CD was we had nightly builds. So every single night we would push up the current version of our code base, and we had these online forums. And so if a user came in and they would sort of go, oh, there's this bug where I don't know the casing is wrong on this query or something's gone wrong. And we would jump in, reply, and say, okay, cool, having a look at that. All right, we fixed that. The nightly build will be up in 4 hours, that'll have this version for you. At this point, no component vendors were doing daily builds, right? I think Telerik added it like 3 or 4 years after the fact. But the thing that really nailed it for our customers was the fact that they could post an issue and not even have to wait 24 hours for a fix. And this actually goes back to the whole quality point where Lightspeed was warnings as errors. I think we had something near the end of like 38,000 unit tests on this ORM. It would run again. This thing was like a quality beast in that regard. But that was what allowed us to move so quickly in terms of turning around fixes, because you can imagine in an ORM, the side effects can get out of control really fast when you're just poking around in how it generates queries. So that was actually quite a lot of fun. And then, like I say, ironically, it ended up doing quite well for us for many, many years, and was a reasonably well-loved product. And then, of course, EF and Link to SQL got announced. And initially, I was like, oh, no, there goes our business, and then it turned out actually having a Megatech educate the market that this is how they should build software, it turns out that's quite expensive, and it's really useful when they tell everybody that they should be doing it this way. And then where we really did well, and to be fair, I'm not sure on the current state today of EF, but firstly, Microsoft killed Link to SQL, which was, of my opinion, the better of the two products. So they left the worst one behind, and then EF for many years was absolutely just the worst performing ORM you could get. And so what we would get is folks saying, hey, well, if I've used Link, to express my queries, and now my app is dog slow, and I need it to go fast. What can I do? And it would be like, well, if you move to Lightspeed, where you just kind of change the context, but actually the link queries all still work, and now your app goes way faster and isn't thrashing the database. That actually became one of the key selling points. Was like, okay, you built it on the free stuff, you got kind of what you paid for. Now make it good, and that worked really well for us.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, as you said, Entity Framework at the first version had its issues. What I saw, a lot of developers were just using it wrong because they didn't fully understand it. And what I thought at that time was that a lot of developers switched to micro ORMs like Dapper, where you had to write the SQL statements on your own. They will just do the object mapping. But having a product that can use the original link statements that somebody wrote for YAF just with another context is brilliant.
Yeah, I will say writing a link provider, especially at the time, was definitely a brain-breaking task. Didn't break my brain. I didn't do the coding on it, but a couple of folks at work who are far smarter than me worked on it, and it was quite challenging to make that work really, really well. I remember at the time, I think there was something like 3 blog posts from randos at Microsoft were like the key documents. And I remember seeing Franz Boomer, who still works in the object relational space with LLBLGN. And I remember, I think on Twitter, watching him as well, kind of pulling his hair out, trying to get that thing into a good state with the level of docs that existed. Because as you can imagine, there's not a lot of times a person actually needs to write a link provider. So it's understandably not super well documented at the time. But yeah.
I think another guy was Oren Aney from Hibernate, and who later founded Hibernating Rhinos. He published a lot of code too that was probably helpful at that time.
Yeah, he was prolific. Old Allende, right? I think is the name he uses online. I remember that used to be at about 2007, the daily, RSS reader, when you'd go and fire that up and see what he's written today. But yeah, so those are good times. We are starting to come to the end of our time. So Maddie might throw up some questions shortly, but before we do part, what would be a couple of key lessons or insights you would like to share with the audience? Perhaps they're developers who are thinking, hey, I would like to start something soon. What would you like to impart to them today?
Yeah, so there are some advice I would like to give. So the first thing is, when you think about building your own company and quitting as a developer, then you have to be absolutely sure that this is what you want to do. Because a lot of people who are developers and want to start their own company, they don't realize that you will not develop that much anymore because you have to take care of the company in order to expand it. That's definitely the first thing. The other thing is, depending on your business model, so let's say that you want to build an agency style of company where you develop software, then it totally helps to build a network up front, which means getting your name somewhere out in the world, like blogging or writing articles, speaking at conferences, speaking at user groups. I mean, this is how we eventually met by a blog post that I wrote. This is how our conversation began. So it's totally important to get your name out in the world so that you have a good network. And then the last thing is, you have really to learn the business side of running a business. So I saw a lot of failing companies or even freelancers because they didn't have an idea how to calculate their prices. So they forgot that they want to go on vacation, that they have to save something for their retirement phase later on, that they have to pay, for example, for their health insurance, and that they will probably not always have a 100% amount of work, which means that you just have to take your time to calculate your pricing. Those are probably the 3 advices. As I said, get your name out there. Think about it. Is this what you want to do? And learn calculation, because what I learned, and this hit me hard after running Quality Bytes for 2 years, was I was totally hands down and writing software all the day. I was working late at night. I came back home. My wife said, well, why are you late? I said, well, because there was this feature I had to finish, this deployment I had to make, this bug I had to fix. And she always asked me, so why don't your employees do that? So why do you have? And I said, well, you don't understand. It's because I know it better, because I'm the expert. And then she eventually gave a book to me on how to build a successful business. And it was like the story of a person who built a software development business, and it didn't take off because this person was too much into software development and didn't take care about the business. I said, well, that's like the author was just visiting my company, because that was totally my life. And so this meant that this transition was what really helped me to take off. And this is something that you have to be totally aware about, that it's not about software developing all the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And even to this day, like I can still write software, and I do occasionally do a little bit of that. Recently, I helped, for example, we migrated from Salesforce into HubSpot, and for my sins, I had written the Salesforce integration years ago. So it felt like one of those, like, well, rather than make the team have to learn this, I'll do it. But I absolutely see what you're saying, which is once I go heads down on something, you notice other problems start to arise in the business, and it's because you're not necessarily spending the time giving context to people, setting the direction, all of those things. And so it's a hidden cost. And it's also a challenge because this would be my sort of tip to folks as well, is that when the going gets tough, people will naturally go and do the thing that they feel like they're good at doing. It gives them a sense that they're actually achieving or making progress. But if you actually if you go and start, say, working on your code rather than working on finding more customers, no amount of code is going to suddenly magically get you a lot more customers. And so you've got to shift those gears. And you've shared a lot of stories about how your wife has supported your business adventure. And I'll use my wife with an example here as well. As I remember, again, with her business, she got to the point where she'd hired a few people. And I think it was one of those, every business has these times where you suddenly go, oh, shoot, I need to get some more customers. And she wasn't sure what to do. And she read this thing about something like 50 coffees in 50 days. It was basically, the challenge was to try and take out 50 people for a coffee over 50 days. And just have a conversation. And in doing so, you guarantee somebody's going to need something from you that you can help them with. And I think she got to something like 12 coffees, and it was like, hey, we're now way too busy. Like we're overloaded in work. But at the same time, while she quite enjoys those conversations, she would be the first to acknowledge as well, it's like, well, if she had the choice between doing work and doing the selling work, she would have preferred the former, but she needed to do the latter, and it worked out for her. So I think fundamentally, a lot of running a business is doing the work that you don't really want to do. But it's a lot of fun. I highly encourage anybody to do it. Maddie, who kind of works behind the scenes here, I'm not sure if we've got any questions here. We do have a few. Sorry, I've shrunk it up. Let's ask some of these. I'll ask them so anybody who's listening can effectively know what they are. How important in today's entrepreneurial market is building the personal brand? Is it necessary for the success of a company? Now, I think you did a great job, Andre, of citing why it's really useful at the very beginning. How have you found it sort of longer term?
Yeah, I think it depends on the size of a company, probably. So when you have a small company, like, for example, Quality Bites had like 20 employees, then the founder and CEO is still the person everybody looks to. So it's super important to build a personal brand there. I think that at some point you have to switch the focus over to putting the company more into the focus. But it totally helps building a personal brand to get the company started.
Awesome. Yep. Definitely agree with that. And how can developers become better writers?
Yeah, there's one easy trick. And this is true for everything that you want to become great at, is just do it. So at first, you won't be good. And it's the same for software. So I guess the first lines of code that everybody of us wrote were not great. However, when we continued to do it over time, we got better and better. And the same is true for writing. So the issue is that when you write source code, and nobody who uses the final product will see if you wrote great source code or bad source code, because, well, it's compiled into the binaries. And so this is a more embarrassing with writing, because, well, when you write something, then a lot of people will read. But the good thing is when you start writing, probably only you and your closest friends will read it and nobody else, which means just do it and start small with social post, blog post, and then continue on writing, well, articles and eventually a book, maybe.
Yeah, and you have written a book. What is it called?
So I've written 2 books. I've written one called Cross-Platform Development with Xamarin Forms. And as Microsoft decided to kill Xamarin Forms, I had to rewrite the book. And so now the new title is Developing Cross-Platform Applications with .NET MAUI. I'm currently writing the 2nd edition of that one.
Oh, great, because there are, I can say there's a lot of questions and interest in Maui at the moment from what we're seeing. So great to have a book out there on it. We've got a few more questions in here. What are some of the common myths about developing mobile apps with .NET MAUI?
Thing one is that it doesn't work. So when you look when you look on the internet, you see a lot of people complaining, and the Reddit is full of people saying that .NET MAUI is the worst development experience they ever had, and there are some magazines writing that Microsoft shipped it too soon. And I think this is all true for version 6 and 7, which were actually version 1 and 2, because they started counting MAUI with version 6.
Yep.
However, with versions 8, it's totally stable, totally usable for real-world products. So we've been using it for new apps, starting with version 7, which was not the nicest development experience, but we were able to actually ship apps. And starting with version 8, it's really, the team did a great job, so you can really build production apps with it. And I think you have issues with every major platform. So when you look at the MAUI repository, you have 3,000 issues. However, when you look at the Flutter repository, you have, like, I don't know, 5,000 issues. So it's not like others are bug-free. I think the biggest myth is that it doesn't work. It works great. It's an awesome choice, especially when you're a .NET developer.
Yeah, cool. And I mean, my impression is I think some of the negativity is out of being the forced move. I think I kind of detect that a little bit in some of the online narrative. It's like, I just didn't want to have to move off Xamarin, and now I'm annoyed. And secondly, I guess I'm much more exposed to the web development side of the world, where you don't necessarily have to be on the latest version of the runtimes. I would pick, if you're building on MAUI, you want to be about as cutting edge as you possibly can with the rate of development going on at the moment.
So we started using the first beta versions of version 8 for our production apps, because they were way more stable than the stable 7 release. But in the web development, I mean, you touched it way at the start of the webinar. When you think about .NET Core versions 1 and 2, they weren't that great because there were a lot of features missing. And at Quality Bytes, we started with version 3 to actually move to .NET Core, because then it was production ready. So it's always the magical 3rd version for Microsoft, where you can use the product in real life scenarios.
Yep.
And that's true for .NET Core, and it's totally true for .NET MAUI as well.
I totally agree with you on that one. One last question, then we'll wrap it up. But and this is a very broad question. What is the future of startups in the software engineering domain? I'm wondering if this might be in the lens, perhaps, of AI or something like that coming along on some of the nerves at the moment. Any take?
Now, I don't know, because I can't predict the future. If I would probably, play the lottery. But no, I think that there are a lot of processes which are not fully digital at right now. So, which means that you can totally build new startups and focus on a specific niche and help them to get from a manual process to a digital process, which means I see a bright future for a lot of people, yeah, founding their own companies. You just have to find the one thing that is missing that everybody wants,
Yeah.
and then just build your business around that.
Yeah, I agree with that. One of the things that was a real eye opener to me when COVID-19 hit
Yeah,
was everybody saw those charts where they had the e-commerce line like jump up,
yeah,
and look, everybody listening to this is probably in technology in some form, so you might all be the same as me, where you're kind of sitting there being like, wait, you're only adopting the internet now? It's like it's been around for 30 years, and there were all these companies scrambling to get online, and you kind of go,
mm,
oh my goodness, we do live at the forefront of technology. The world and the bubble in which we live. We're sitting here talking about the differences between version 8 and 7 of .NET Core, and these people are sort of wondering whether they're going to unbox the fax modem one day soon. It's kind of,
yeah,
you forget that a little bit, but that's
yeah,
also on the entrepreneurial journey. That is the market. You don't have to sell at the cutting edge. There is always buyers out there. Hey, Andre, we could have gone on for hours. This has been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed the mix of topics. I hope our listeners have as well. I'd like to just extend a huge thank you to you for both the articles and things that you've written about Raygun, but also joining us today on Founder and Friends. It's been a real pleasure.
yeah. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed that as well,
Yep.
and was a great experience.
You're welcome. And to that experience, I'll just briefly acknowledge as well Madison Daish, who works behind the scenes to actually put all of this together.
Yeah.
She makes Andre and I look good here, but she is taking care of everything. So thanks so much for all of your work on that as well, Maddie. And until the next Founder and Friends, everybody, code well, and we'll see you again soon.